Ever read through a Harry Potter subreddit thread and thought, wait, that's actually a good point? Today we're ranking the 16 wildest unpopular opinions in the fandom. From mild reconsiderations all the way to full-blown Snape apostasy. Some of these might genuinely change how you watch the series. We're starting easy. These first few are technically unpopular, but honestly, they're just correct. Quidditch's rules are actually fair. In a sport where catching one tiny golden ball is worth 150 points and the victory, fair feels like a stretch, sure. But think about what that catch actually demands. Flying at full speed, in 3 dimensions, while a pair of bludgers try their best to knock you unconscious. That's not a cheat code. That's a reward for the single hardest, most dangerous job on the pitch. And Muggle sports run on the exact same logic, handing the biggest, most decisive plays to whoever's already the field's best specialist. A striker, a closer, a quarterback. Quidditch just makes that specialist fly. A team can dominate for 90 minutes, outscore the other side by hundreds of points, and still lose. Because their seeker had one bad afternoon. And yeah, on paper, that sounds broken. Ask any football fan how they feel about a shootout deciding a match after 90 minutes of actual play, though, and suddenly, the seeker decides everything stops sounding so Wizard exclusive. Not really a hot take. Just people who haven't watched enough professional sports complaining about a system nearly every sport shares. Flip the rule around and it gets worse, not better. Drop the snitch to 10 points instead of 150, and nobody bothers training seekers at all. Every match turns into an endless chaser slugfest, and the single most spectacular position in the sport goes extinct. The Wizarding world accidentally built a game where the flashiest role is also the most mechanically important one. Muggle sports spend entire off-seasons and rule committees chasing that exact balance. Wizards just made the ball worth a lot of points and called it a day. Next up, we have the opinion it was sensible for Hagrid to get fluffy. A 3-headed dog guarding a hallway in a school full of 11-year-olds sounds completely unhinged. Until you remember, Fluffy wasn't a permanent fixture or Hagrid's personal pet running wild through the corridors. He was there for one job, guarding the single most valuable magical object hidden in the castle that year. And once that job ended, Fluffy went back to Greece, his natural habitat, according to Rowling herself, like a contractor wrapping up and heading home. That's not reckless pet ownership, slipping past a castle full of oblivious adults. That's a purpose-built security system that happened to also enjoy music. Want an unbreakable vault door? Fine. That's boring, muggle-brained thinking. Hagrid wanted a dog with 3 mouths and 0 bribability. Reckless choice of companion generally? Obviously, we've all seen what happens with dragon eggs. Bad security plan specifically? Not even close. Then there's the quiet love for the S.P.E.W plotline. The one storyline everyone loves to roll their eyes at and skip on a reread. Hermione launches a campaign for house elf rights. Barely anyone takes her seriously, and she spends 2 entire books getting politely ignored by her own best friends. Annoying, sure, if you have only read it at face value. Widen the lens, though, and S.P.E.W is doing something none of the other subplots dare to attempt. It's asking the Wizarding world to actually look at its own comfortable cruelty and flinch. House elves have been enslaved for centuries, and everyone just accepts it. The same way nobody questions why goblins run the entire banking system, but aren't allowed to carry their own wands. Hermione's the only character who notices the rot sitting underneath the magic. And yes, she's clumsy about it, a little condescending too, but she's also the only person in 7 books willing to get laughed at repeatedly for doing the right thing anyway. That's not a boring subplot padding out book 4. That's the moral spine of the entire series, shrunk down into a knitted hat. And here's the joke that basically writes itself. A society that can conjure food from nothing, heal broken bones in an afternoon, and fly around on a stick still can't be bothered to pay its own workforce. Muggles at least argue about minimum wage. Wizards enchant the argument out of conversation entirely, because the elves themselves have been conditioned to want their own servitude. That's not a quirky world-building quirk. That's one of the darkest things buried inside a children's book, and Hermione's the only one who clocks it. Speaking of things that get dismissed too fast, let's talk about the single saddest death in the entire series. And it might not be the one you're expecting. Not Sirius, not Dobby, Cedric Diggory. Weeks from finishing school, his whole life stacked up neatly in front of him, and he doesn't die saving anyone or going down swinging in some final battle. He dies because he grabbed a cup at the wrong second, alongside someone he'd just decided to trust. Wrong place, wrong time, full stop. No lesson attached. Then there's his dad. Amos Diggory barely gets real screen time across the books, but in every scene he's in, he's beaming about his son. The Quidditch talent, the Triwizard glory, completely unaware he's about to bury him within the year. That's the gut punch nobody warns you about going in. Not a hero's noble sacrifice. Just a father's pride quietly curdling into grief inside one graveyard scene. Cedric's death refuses all of that comfort. He was just there. And that randomness is exactly why it lingers longer, for a lot of readers, than deaths with a far bigger body count attached. Last casual take before we turn up the heat. The broomstick economy in Quidditch is genuinely unfair, and the camping chapters in the final book deserve way more credit than they usually get. That's two opinions, so let's start with the broom thing first. In a sport supposedly built around raw skill, the wealthiest families can simply buy their kid the fastest broom currently on the market. No trial, no qualifying run, straight off the shelf. That's not a level playing field. That's pay to win with a Nimbus logo stitched onto the handle. And the wild part is that nobody in-world seems remotely bothered by it, which says a lot more about how normalized wealth inequality is across the entire wizarding world than it does about Quidditch specifically. As for the camping chapters, the section everyone loves to call the slow part and skip on a reread, that's the exact stretch where Harry, Ron, and Hermione get stripped of Hogwarts, of adult supervision, of any real plan, and have to survive purely as themselves, with no castle walls to hide behind. It's the most emotionally exposed the trio ever gets across 7 books. Slow? Sure. Boring? Not even close. That's only half the story, though. Once you're done nodding along to the easy stuff, the fandom starts getting noticeably more opinionated from here. The kind of takes that earn you a raised eyebrow at a dinner party, if not a full-on argument. Nitpick time. A solid chunk of the fandom hates Harry's kids' names, and honestly, fair. Albus Severus Potter is a name built entirely out of guilt and posthumous forgiveness, not something you'd actually inflict on a real child at a ministry registration desk. But the sharper version of this opinion isn't really about naming at all. It's about timing. A lot of fans think Harry and Ginny's real spark should have started back in Order of the Phoenix, in that quiet moment where Ginny comforts him about the whole possession ordeal, instead of getting essentially fast-forwarded into existence a book later. That's a legitimate structural gripe, not just fandom nitpicking, once you widen the lens. Rowling spends 5 books carefully building Ginny into someone genuinely comfortable and unguarded around Harry, then treats the actual romantic ignition almost as an afterthought squeezed into book 6. The pairing works fine on the page. The build-up just deserved a much bigger spotlight than it got. The movie's genuinely botched Rita Skeeter, and it's one of those adaptation choices that quietly guts a great reveal. In the books, discovering she's an unregistered animagus, sneaking around Hogwarts grounds as a beetle to eavesdrop on private conversations she has zero business hearing, lands as a proper, wait, what? Moment. And it actually matters, because it's Hermione outsmarting a professional adult journalist using nothing but her own research and a jam jar. The films introduce Skeeter with all her venom fully intact, and then just let her fade quietly out of the story. None of the payoff that made the reveal land in print. That's the wizarding equivalent of setting up an entire corporate espionage thriller and forgetting to actually reveal the spy. Muggle journalism has ethics boards, retractions, and libel lawsuits waiting in the wings. Wizarding journalism apparently has one woman who turns into an insect and nobody catches her for years. Wild detail to just quietly drop on the cutting room floor. Bigger one now. Harry Potter is a genuinely great character. Full stop. And the "he's boring, he did nothing without his friends" crowd is being unfair to him. Strip away the scar and the prophecy for a second, and what's actually left is a kid raised in a cupboard by relatives who resented his entire existence, thrown into a world that expects him to be a legend on sight, and somehow he comes out the other side still fundamentally kind. He shares his prize money. He defends people who genuinely can't defend themselves. He never actually wants to hurt anyone, even when he's got justification to. Rowling had every excuse in the world to write him bitter, vengeful, arrogant about all the attention, and largely chose not to. Sure, he's sometimes carried tactically by Ron and Hermione, obviously, but leadership was never about doing everything solo. It's about making the people around you better under pressure. And Harry does exactly that for 7 books straight. The boring protagonist complaint says more about what people expect a hero to perform than what Harry actually is on the page. Picture the Muggle version of this story for a second. A kid abused for a decade by the only family he has, suddenly handed fame, money, and a target on his back all at once. Realistically, that kid grows up guarded, maybe cruel, definitely suspicious of everyone around him. Harry grows up funny, loyal to a fault, willing to walk into near certain death for people he's known for a matter of months. Not boring. That's a character quietly resisting the exact trauma response the setup practically demands of him, book after book, without the story ever making a speech of it. And while we're defending him, Harry's anger throughout Order of the Phoenix was completely justified, and writing it off as moody teenager energy misses the entire point of the book. He just watched a classmate murdered directly in front of him, then came home for the summer to a government publicly branding him a liar, a newspaper running smear pieces on a 15-year-old, and months of total isolation with basically zero information from the adults who claim to protect him. Anyone, Muggle or Wizard, turns into a live wire under those conditions. What makes it worse is the tonal whiplash the book pulls off. 4 straight books of The Boy Who Lived, and then overnight, the entire wizarding world flips on him, like he's somehow the problem. That's not moodiness. That's trauma with genuinely nowhere to go. The book that gets the most fan pushback for Harry being insufferable might honestly be the one where he's finally acting the most like an actual, believable human being would. And this is where it gets stranger, because now we're wading into the takes that genuinely split rooms. The kind that get a, wait, hold on, reaction, even out of lifelong fans. Some fans think the fandom's straight up unfair to Dumbledore, and that Ginny's a perfectly fine pairing for Harry, not the disappointing consolation prize some shippers treat her as online. The Dumbledore criticism usually comes down entirely to hindsight. Sure, plenty of his choices around withholding information from Harry look genuinely questionable in the rearview mirror, but he's also simultaneously running a war, managing a decades-old prophecy, and protecting one teenager's physical safety, all with dangerously imperfect information the whole time. Ginny, meanwhile, is confident, sharp, a genuinely talented Quidditch player in her own right, and one of the only people in the entire series who treats Harry like an actual person instead of a walking legend. Plenty of fans wanted Harry with Hermione, sure. Some wanted a slower, more visible burn, and that preference is fine. Saying a pairing felt underwhelming and saying it was objectively wrong are two very different arguments, though, and only one of them actually holds up. Job preference take now. Oddly divisive for something this small. Harry should have become the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, not an Auror. What actually makes Harry good at anything across the series was never raw magical talent, and it was definitely never encyclopedic spell knowledge. Hermione beats him on both fronts easily. It's hands-on, practical experience surviving genuinely lethal threats, which is literally what he did for an entire year running Dumbledore's army in secret. The one skill the books repeatedly show him naturally gifted at, teaching other people. And Auror's actual day-to-day is paperwork, desk work, chasing cold leads through bureaucracy. A Death Against the Dark Arts classroom is where Harry's real strength lives, handing that exact survival instinct down to the next generation of students. Sending him into an office job feels like wasted potential when the book's already proved, on the page, he's a mentor first and a field agent a distant second. Then there's the take that sounds like a joke until you realize people mean it completely seriously. A Harry Potter musical is more canon, emotionally, than Cursed Child. One's a scrappy, low-budget fan production leaning fully into the absurdity already baked into the books, and it somehow captures the characters' actual chemistry and humor better than an official, Rowling-approved stage sequel busy rewriting established lore to serve a twisty time travel plot. Genuinely strange place for a fandom to land, openly preferring the unofficial parody over the sanctioned canon follow-up, but it says something real about what fans actually value here. Voice and personality over plot mechanics. One popular fan theory is that people connect faster with something built entirely out of love for the source material than with something built mainly to justify its own existence as a sequel nobody strictly asked for. Alright, we've been building toward this. These last 4 are the ones that get people typing in all caps in the replies. House everyone assumes is soft and safe first. Hufflepuffs are not necessarily nice people. Loyal? Absolutely, no argument there. Hardworking? Patient? Fair-minded? Sure, that tracks. Kindness was never actually the sorting criteria to begin with, though. And go looking at the actual named Hufflepuffs on the page instead of the fandom's collective idea of them, and the pattern falls apart fast. Ernie Macmillan's defining trait isn't warmth, it's pomposity. Zacharias Smith is, by just about every account in the text, an outright jerk to everyone around him. One popular theory among fans is that kind people probably do get sorted into Hufflepuff more often statistically, but only because kindness tends to travel alongside loyalty and patience anyway, not because the house is actually built around it directly. Small distinction, genuinely big consequence. Hufflepuff and nice have been quietly merged in fandom shorthand for 2 decades, and the books themselves never actually promised that equation. It's the wizarding equivalent of assuming every accountant is boring purely because the job sounds unglamorous. Loyalty, patience, and hard work are values, not personality traits. And mixing the two up is exactly how an entire house full of complicated, sometimes prickly people gets flattened into one comfortable stereotype. Even spicier, Hagrid was a better father figure to Harry than either Dumbledore or Sirius. And the way the other characters treat him, like a lovable, oversized mistake who happens to know some magic, never actually catches up with that fact. Think about who's genuinely consistent in Harry's life across 7 years. Dumbledore withholds critical information for months, sometimes years at a stretch. Choices that make sense strategically, but land as cold and manipulative to a kid who's already lost everyone. Sirius, understandably damaged by over a decade in Azkaban, sometimes projects his own unresolved trauma onto Harry instead of actually seeing him clearly as his own person. Hagrid does neither. He's the first adult who ever tells Harry the truth about who he is and where he came from. And he keeps showing up again and again with nothing but blunt, uncomplicated affection and zero hidden agenda. Obviously, his judgment around dangerous magical creatures is genuinely reckless. We've all watched him hatch a dragon inside a wooden house. But reckless with dragon eggs and bad father figure simply aren't the same category or flaw. And the books consistently frame him as a comic relief instead of crediting him for the emotional stability he actually quietly provides. Ask a Muggle kid who grew up in foster care to describe the one adult who never lied to them and always turned up. And it's rarely the polished, strategic guardian making hard calls from a distance. It's the messy, imperfect one who shows up anyway. Every time, with cake that's slightly too dense and a heart that's entirely in the right place. Now for the one that turns a beloved side character into an accusation. Harry did Luna wrong, and got away with it because he happened to be the protagonist. Sounds harsh until you actually walk through the sequence in order. Luna risks her life going with the group to the Ministry in Book 5. No hesitation, despite barely knowing them well. She comes back to discover her belongings have been stolen and hidden by other students for months as bullying. Tells Harry directly about it and gets essentially a shrug in return. The following year, the group doesn't just drift away from her naturally. They leave her out almost entirely, despite knowing full well she has no other real friends at school to fall back on. She quietly asks if they'd consider restarting Dumbledore's army together. They say no, and she admits, almost offhand, that it was nice while it lasted, that it was almost like having friends again, and the group's response lands closer to mild, passing awkwardness than any real guilt. That's not a minor blind spot you can wave away, and it's not a one-off slip either. It's a pattern, repeated across multiple books, with multiple chances along the way to actually correct it. What makes it land so uncomfortably is that Harry's generally shown as fundamentally kind throughout the series, which is exactly why this specific pattern is so hard to sit with. Good people can still consistently fail the people who never demand their attention loudly enough. It's a very Muggle pattern, too, if you think about it. The quiet, odd kid at school who never causes trouble is so often the easiest one to overlook, precisely because they never make a scene about being overlooked. Luna never once guilt-trips the trio for forgetting her. She just quietly notes it and moves on, which somehow makes the whole thing land even harder for the reader than if she'd actually complained. And now, the one that draws the most pushbacks of all 16, every single time it's brought up. Snape wasn't a good guy. Not morally gray, not misunderstood, not quietly redeemed in love by the final act. Just genuinely not a good man. Full stop. His feelings for Lily were real, yes, and that grief clearly shaped decades of increasingly bitter choices. But love was never a character reference, and it was never supposed to be one. He spent years actively tormenting an 11-year-old for the unforgivable crime of resembling his dead father's old school bully, weaponized his position of institutional power against students who'd genuinely never done anything wrong to him personally, and made choices. Cruel, petty, sometimes outright dangerous to children in his care, entirely independent of any of that backstory. Snape was secretly good all along crowd tends to lean on the idea that his final act, protecting Harry purely out of love for Lily, retroactively cancels out everything that came before it. Motive was never the same thing as morality, though. A twisted, obsessive, unresolved version of love can absolutely coexist with genuine, deliberate cruelty toward people who had nothing to do with any of it. And Snape might be the clearest single proof of that principle in the entire series. Not the villain, not secretly the hero underneath it all either. Just a deeply damaged, deeply unkind man who did one good thing for a genuinely bad reason. And the fandom has spent 2 decades quietly upgrading that one act into a redemption arc it never actually earned on the page. Here's the uncomfortable comparison nobody likes to sit with. Picture any teacher, muggle or magical, spending years verbally tearing down one specific student in front of the entire class, purely because that kid's face reminds them of somebody they resent. In the real world, that's not a tragic backstory. That's a workplace complaint, a parent meeting, potentially a firing. The wizarding world just hands him a castle office and calls it complicated. It is complicated, it's just not good. So here's where that leaves us. 16 opinions, 4 full tiers, and somehow the fandom still agrees on almost none of it, start to finish. The wizarding world chose complicated over comfortable, every single time. And if you thought this fandom got heated over character opinions, wait until you see what happens the moment you start picking apart the plot holes nobody actually wants to admit are sitting right there in plain sight. Which Harry Potter plot hole actually breaks the entire series wide open?